There is something about the 1960s in San Francisco that still feels alive in the memory, like the city itself is whispering through the fog. The foghorn would wake you before sunrise, that deep, mournful call cutting through the chill morning air, echoing off the bay like a distant ship's lament. You'd press your nose to the window, feeling the damp cold seep through the glass, and watch the thick blanket of fog roll in from the Golden Gate, turning the world into a soft, gray mystery. And somewhere down below, the cable car was clanging its way up Powell Street, the bell ringing sharp and insistent, sparks flickering from the overhead wires like fleeting stars against the pre-dawn gloom. If you grew up in San Francisco in the 1960s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The sound of those Powell Mason cable cars swaying and groaning up the hills. The smell of sourdough bread from the Italian bakeries in North Beach, mixing with the salty brine from the bay and the faint, earthy scent of redwood from nearby forests. The feeling of running through your neighborhood until the street lamps flickered on, knowing every steep hill, every hidden alleyway, every neighbor's name and their kids' names and what time they headed out for the morning ferry. This was a San Francisco that has completely disappeared, a city where a 16-year-old could walk into a cannery on Fisherman's Wharf and start work the same week, where you could ride from one end of the city to the other for 15 cents, where downtown meant getting dressed up because Market Street was somewhere special. We're going back to that San Francisco now, to the neighborhoods and the routines and the feeling of a city that moved at the pace of its famous fog.
Your world had boundaries everyone understood, invisible lines drawn by cable car routes and the kinds of shops on each block. The Chinese families lived around Grant Avenue in Chinatown, where elderly women in silk cheongsams would sit on stoops fanning themselves with paper fans, their voices carrying down the street in rapid Cantonese that sounded like a melody even when you couldn't understand the words. The Italians had North Beach, where men in fedoras sat in cafes playing chess and sipping espresso from cups so small they looked like thimbles, where the bakeries opened before dawn and filled the morning air with the tangy scent of fresh sourdough, so powerful it could wake you up 3 blocks away. The beatniks were gathering in the cafes on Columbus Avenue, reciting poetry under dim lights, the smell of cigarette smoke and strong coffee lingering like a haze. And Haight-Ashbury was beginning to stir with the first whispers of something new. Young people with long hair and colorful clothes, the faint scent of incense and patchouli drifting from head shops. Each neighborhood had its own personality, its own rhythm, its own smell, but somehow it all fit together into something that felt distinctly, unmistakably San Francisco. The radiator in your bedroom would clang and hiss as steam heat pushed through pipes installed when your house was built 40 years earlier. The smell of dust burning off the metal coils, mixing with the cold, damp air that leaked in around the window frame, carrying hints of ocean salt. Downstairs, your mother had already brought in the milk bottles from the front porch, glass bottles with foil caps that sometimes froze and pushed up an inch above the rim like tiny icy towers. She'd set them in the icebox with that distinctive clink of glass on glass, a sound as reliable as the foghorns on Sunday morning. You'd pull on your wool sweater, the one that scratched your neck no matter how many times it had been washed, and your rubber boots with the metal clasps that would freeze shut if you left them on the porch overnight, and head out into the chill to join the other kids making their way to school through fog that clung to the hills like a soft blanket, turning every street into a misty adventure. Nobody drove you to school unless there was a rare storm brewing over the Pacific. You walked, sometimes a mile or more, up and down the steep inclines that made your calves ache by the time you reached the top, past Victorian houses identical to yours, painted in pastel shades that faded softly in the fog, past corner stores that smelled like fresh bread and newspaper ink, past the cable car stops where adults stood stamping their feet to keep warm, their breath forming clouds in the damp air. One person who grew up near Market Street remembered you could walk anywhere in the city, any time of day or night, and feel completely safe. And that wasn't nostalgia talking, that was just how it was.
The cable cars ran constantly, green and yellow cars swaying slightly as they climbed the hills, sparks flying from the overhead wires, the bells clanging warnings at cars that got too close. Inside, they smelled like damp wool and too many people pressed together, the floor tracked with mud and salt that would melt into gray puddles around the doors. An old Italian man would be reading the Chronicle near the back. A woman in a fur collar would clutch her shopping bags close. The gripman sat behind his metal lever, making change without looking, his hands moving through the routine of 1,000 mornings just like this one. And you'd stand there swaying with the motion of the car, watching San Francisco slide past through the fogged windows like scenes in a movie you'd seen before but never got tired of watching. The bay glimmering in the distance, the Golden Gate Bridge peeking through the mist like a rusty red giant. After school, you'd stop at the corner store, a small universe that existed in every neighborhood, where the wooden floor creaked under your boots and the air smelled like fresh bread and something sweet you could never quite identify, perhaps the candy jars or the fresh produce. The candy counter ran along one wall, jar after jar of possibilities, black licorice twists, jawbreakers that would last all afternoon if you didn't bite down, wax lips and peppermint sticks. The man behind the counter wore a cardigan and reading glasses that sat low on his nose, and he'd count out your candy piece by piece, dropping them into a small paper bag that crinkled satisfyingly. 5 cents buying you plenty if you chose wisely. You'd make those candies last the whole walk home, letting each one dissolve slowly on your tongue, savoring the sweetness like it was the last good thing you'd ever taste. And by the time you got home, your fingers would be sticky and your pockets would be empty, but you'd feel rich in a way that had nothing to do with money. The real heart of San Francisco lived downtown, and Saturday mornings meant taking the cable car to Emporium or Macy's, the great department stores that anchored Union Square like elegant anchors in a sea of shoppers. You'd spend hours there, wandering through departments that felt like separate worlds, your mother doing her shopping while you explored. The toy section at Macy's had metal trucks that could survive being thrown downstairs, dolls with real hair that smelled faintly of plastic, model train sets displayed in glass cases that you'd press your nose against until your breath fogged the glass. The fabric department at Emporium smelled like cotton and possibility. Bolts of cloth stacked to the ceiling in every color you could imagine. Your mother running her hands over different textures, while the saleswoman in her neat dress and pinned hair offered suggestions in that formal way people spoke when they were working. Someone who grew up then still remembers those hot dogs and orange drink in the Emporium basement, a small detail that somehow survived 60 years in memory, the kind of thing that means nothing and everything at the same time. The lunch counters on the 5th floor served simple food to shoppers who'd been on their feet for hours. Grilled cheese sandwiches with the bread toasted to a perfect golden, chicken noodle soup with steam rising in savory wisps, coffee in heavy ceramic cups that kept burning your tongue even after you'd blown on it 3 times. The waitress knew the regulars by name, knew how they liked their coffee, would slip you an extra cookie without charging. And you'd sit there on the vinyl stool that spun if you twisted back and forth, watching the city pass by outside the windows, trams clanging, people in hats and coats hurrying along the sidewalks. San Francisco spread out below you like a living map, the bay sparkling in the distance, Alcatraz sitting like a lonely sentinel in the water. At Christmas, the store windows at both Macy's and Emporium became animated wonderlands, mechanical toys moving through miniature scenes, and you'd stand there in the December chill with your breath turning to fog, feeling like magic was real, and it lived right here on Union Square. The crowds would gather every evening, families pressed close together, everyone watching the same displays, sharing the same wonder. And for those few minutes, all of San Francisco felt connected by something simple and beautiful. Winter in San Francisco back then was something you prepared for and endured together, a season that shaped your entire year. By January, the fog would roll in thick as pea soup, muting the city sounds and wrapping everything in a damp embrace. And you'd play in the streets or parks, building forts from cardboard boxes or exploring the misty hills, your breath visible in the cold air. Someone would always be the designated lookout, and when a car needed to pass, everyone would scatter to the curbs, yelling "car" and dragging your makeshift nets aside, waiting impatiently for the vehicle to pass before flooding back onto the pavement.
Nobody wore helmets. Nobody worried about liability. You'd play until your fingers went numb inside your wool mittens, until your jeans were soaked through from falling, until the winter sun started dropping behind the hills and turned the fog pink and gold. And your mother's voice would cut through the chill air, calling you home for dinner, her breath visible from the porch 3 houses away. You grew up in a San Francisco that no longer exists, a city that has been buried under highways and skyscrapers and a pace of life that would have seemed impossible then. The smells and the sounds and the rhythms of daily life have all vanished. The clang of cable car bells at sunrise, the smell of bakeries on Columbus Avenue mixing with sea salt, the feeling of wet wool mittens drying on radiators, the taste of penny candy from the corner store, the sound of your mother's voice calling you home through the fog. But here's what hasn't vanished. The memories. They live in you, vivid and real, more powerful than any photograph could ever be. And when you close your eyes, you can still hear that foghorn, still smell that sourdough, still feel that chill air on your face. And for just a moment, you're back there, standing on your front porch in 1965, watching San Francisco wake up on a foggy morning, young and free and completely alive. That city is gone, but it lives on in every person who knew it, in every story shared, in every memory kept alive by the simple act of remembering. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything. If this journey through 1960